Thank you. There are 3 simple rules to attending a class in the Marine Corps. First, you must be on time, which means 15 minutes early. Secondly, you must be prepared. And finally, and most importantly, when you're in class, you must pay strict attention. And the reason it's so important to pay strict attention while you're in class is the presence of Marine Corps sergeants in the back of the room. It's the entire purpose of these sergeants to ensure that you pay attention. And this was my mentality when I entered into my first 8 a.m. class at UVA. It was an 8 a.m. class, so I arrived at 7:40. I was very neatly dressed, and I had read the syllabus and all assigned material. So you can imagine my surprise when I arrived at 7:40 to find that I was the only person there in a 300-person lecture hall. The other students did eventually start to arrive, but I noticed they hadn't gotten the memo about professional dress, because about half of them were wearing pajamas. And I remember one girl wearing furry dog head slippers. So the class starts, and the professor starts to lecture, and I'm paying very close attention. In the Marine Corps, we say we're locked on. So I'm locked on when I hear something crunching behind me. So I turn around, and there's a student eating a bowl of cereal. I thought, okay. So I look to my right, and there's a student reading the Washington Post. And I look to my left, and there's a student doing a crossword puzzle. Now, I almost had a flashback to my Marine Corps sergeant days, but that's when it hit me that I had crossed a boundary into a new world. Now, when I think back to this story, it always makes me laugh, but it does highlight some important cultural differences between the military and civilian life. Now, these differences exist in the absence of war. However, when you add the current combat experiences that this generation of veterans are facing, it can seem that there is a complete disconnect. This disconnect is captured brilliantly by Ben Fountain in his 2012 book, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. Now, the book takes place during a football game, a Thanksgiving Day football game, where Billy and members of his Bravo squad have been invited to participate in the halftime show during this football game. And Billy describes his perceptions of the Americans that he meets at this game. Here's the quote. "No matter their age or station in life, Billy can't help but regard his fellow Americans as children. They are bold and proud and certain in the way of clever children blessed with too much self-esteem, and no amount of lecturing will enlighten them as to the state of pure sin towards which war inclines. Billy loves them, he hates them, he pities them, he envies them, these boys and girls, these children, these infants, these toddlers. Americans are children who must go somewhere else to grow up and sometimes die." Since the institution of the all-volunteer military in 1973, the gap between those who have served in the military and those who have not in American society has been widening. Today, that gap is the largest it's been in American history. Now, I'd like to conduct a small experiment, and there's no judgment with this experiment. This is simply to give us a lay of the land. So I'd like to ask everybody in the audience who has served in the military to please raise their hand. Okay, now take a second to look around you. Currently, less than 1% of Americans have served in the 2 longest wars in American history, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Furthermore, only 7% of the American population has any military experience at all. That means that 93% of America has little to no familiarity with the military. Additionally, military experience in Congress is also at an all-time low. According to a report by the Brookings Institution, around 20% of Congress currently has military experience. Compare this to 1977, when a combined 80% of Congress had military experience. And you may ask, so what? Isn't it better for fewer Americans to have to fight in our wars? While this idea does seem to make sense, it turns out that the Founding Fathers were actually very concerned about a separation between soldier and citizen in America. Samuel Adams, in addition to his beer-brewing prowess, once said, "A standing army, no matter how necessary it may be at times, is always a danger to the liberties of the people. The soldiers are apt to consider themselves as a body distinct from the rest of the citizens." Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that we are rapidly moving towards a society where the soldiers are a distinct body from the rest of the American citizens. Now, this lack of military experience in Congress, coupled with the brutal efficacy of our all-volunteer military has led to an increased willingness to resort to military force to solve our foreign problems. According to a report published by the Congressional Research Service, there have been 144 military deployments in the 40 years since the implementation of the all-volunteer military. Compare this to 19 deployments during the 27-year period following World War II until Vietnam. As you can see from the graphic above, as military experience in Congress has decreased, the number of military deployments has literally skyrocketed. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this gap between the military and civilians is what happens to these soldiers when they return home. Because so few Americans actually have military experience, it's quite often that these veterans will fall through the cracks of society and fall into despair. Last year, veteran suicides actually outnumbered the number of combat fatalities suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan. Currently, 22 veterans a day are taking their lives. This means that during this day of TED Talks, 22 veterans will have killed themselves. Another disturbing statistic is that although veterans only constitute 7% of the American population, they make up 25% of the homeless population. Now, in addition to being damaged goods, wounded warriors, the other dominant narrative in our culture portrays veterans as heroes, applauding them in airports and cheering them in parades. And while this is a very nice gesture, it turns out that many veterans, depending upon the experiences they had in combat, may not welcome this kind of attention. It may appear disingenuous. It could even be harmful, depending on that veteran's particular experiences. Once again, I turned to Billy Lynn to describe the halftime experiences of Bravo Squad, which were supposed to celebrate their heroism. If ever there were a primetime trigger for PTSD, this was it. But lucky for Norm, the crowd, the 40 million plus TV viewing audience, Bravos can deal. Oh yes, pupils dilated, pulse and blood pressure through the roof, limbs trembling with stress reflex cortisol rush, but it's cool, it's good, their shit's down tight. No Vietnam vet crack-ups for Bravo Squad. You could send these boys straight into sound and light show hell, and Bravos could deal. But damn, isn't it rude to put them through it? So what's the answer? What are we supposed to do to help bridge this gap between soldiers and citizens in America? I would argue that in the absence of direct military experience, there at least needs to be reliable information on what it means to serve in the military. Now, as both a veteran and a scholar, I've worked very hard over the past several years to try to inform both the academic and the public discourses surrounding the military. My own research has to do with military veterans and community involvement. I ask the questions, is there a link between what motivates one to serve in the military and what motivates one to serve in their communities? And furthermore, do veterans acquire skills and values during their training that facilitate community involvement, such as leadership skills, teamwork skills, problem-solving skills? And my goal in undertaking this research was to demonstrate that veterans are not simply wounded warriors, but that they can serve as valuable community assets. Last April at Virginia Tech, we convened the first nationwide academic conference dedicated solely to veteran-related research. The conference was titled Veterans in Society, Shifting the Discourse. This is a piece of art that was submitted by one of the scholars. And this piece of art is called Unity, and it's supposed to demonstrate the difficulties of serving as both a soldier in our society as well as being a veteran. Now, the conference was a resounding success. We had around 100 participants from across the United States, and the conversations and relationships that we built were tremendous. So much so that the Conference Planning Committee intends this to be an annual event. We're currently in the process of planning this year's conference, which is called Veterans in Society, Humanizing the Discourse. It is our hope that these events will lead to the creation of a multidisciplinary field of study called Veteran Studies, which can work towards informing these discourses surrounding the military. In addition to the work that I've been doing, there are lots of people around the United States who are working diligently to try to bridge this gap between veterans and civilians in our society. In 2008, former Marine Larry Winters and Army Chaplain Scott Thompson, they put forward an effort called the Veteran-Civilian Dialogue. Now, the mission of the veteran-civilian dialogue is to provide tools for reconciliation and healing between veterans and civilians alike. Larry's a Vietnam veteran, and during his service in Vietnam, he suffered several moral injuries. A moral injury is defined as when an act of war transgresses an individual's deeply held moral beliefs. And this type of injury can cause that individual to lose their faith in humanity and withdraw from society. And Larry said that his moral injuries were not really healed until he had conversations with other civilians. He said when he and his Marine Corps buddies would get together, they would simply hash out what had happened in Vietnam, which didn't help. The veteran-civilian dialogue was born out of Larry's realization that there's great potential for veterans to be healed by civilians and for civilians to be healed by veterans. Barbara Costigan, one of the first veteran-civilian dialogue participants, described the process to me as a lot of listening to find points of light and points of empathy that can be shared between veterans and civilians alike. And Barbara shared a story with me of a veteran who had been ordered to go in and forcibly relocate families from their homes to a base camp. And this soldier described an experience where he went in and he was relocating these families, and he saw a young boy, and the boy had a look of absolute terror on his face. And seeing that look of terror and feeling a sense of responsibility morally injured this guy. And as Barbara was listening to this story, she realized that she had also seen that look of terror on a young boy's face when she once punched her young son. Now, these events happened in very different circumstances, but they do provide an example of how veterans and civilians can relate to one another. The boundary between veterans and civilians presents a major challenge to our society on multiple dimensions. The institution of the all-volunteer military has widened this gap and has made it very difficult for veterans to relate, and as Sam Adams warned, has set our soldiers and our citizens apart from one another. Lacking military experience, most Americans now turn to the media and entertainment to inform them on what it means to serve in the military. However, media stereotypes simply do not accurately capture the experiences of most veterans. So if we truly want to bridge this gap, we need to ask ourselves and each other what it means to serve in the military, what it means to be a civilian, and perhaps most importantly, what it means to be a citizen. Now, Veterans Day is coming up this week, so this could be a great opportunity to have those conversations. If you're a veteran, maybe share your stories with a civilian. And if you're a civilian, you meet a veteran, maybe ask them what their experiences were like. And I think we might find, if we stop and truly speak to one another, that we have much more in common than we thought, and that we can move beyond this boundary through deeper understandings and an appeal to a shared human dignity. Thank you very much.